logged in.
Yeah, there you go. Cool. That's
Okay,
what.
that's all right. Awesome.
Rocket City and stuff.
Yeah. So you were saying, oh, we're talking about legislative uh, track record, and you were saying you had some success over the last 10 years.
Yeah, no, for sure. So where I was going with that, the main, 10 years ago, coming up at this point, the main objective for BugCrowd was to basically convince, the internet that the idea itself wasn't insane, because like historically, and this is reflected in legislation. I think, most things were written without the concept of good faith,
Right.
and even really existing at that point in time. It's all like, if you're hacking a computer, that's probably bad. So let's write laws that kind of reflect that. And for us, from like a marketing and a problem solution fit standpoint, we had to basically go out and explain to everyone that like there is such a thing as a good hacker. And that was really the first 3 or 4 years of kind of what we worked on that ultimately led to the growth of the company at that point in time. So there was lots of different components to that, but I think that the parts that were quite successful from a legislative standpoint, the Hack the Pentagon program, like in the US, that was a massive signal to pretty much everyone. It's like, okay, if the DoD, who are basically like the apex, defender and predator on the planet, going out and asking for help, then maybe this isn't such a bad idea for the rest of us too. I think that was a pretty big signal at that point.
Well, it legitimized, it legitimized what you were doing.
It legitimized our space, but I think the transitive property of that was it legitimized hackers just period across the board. So like that was one of the things that got the ball rolling. Working with Congressman Liu's office and Jim Langvin's office out of the Capitol for the hack the XYZ bills. There was a bunch of different things that got proposed and adopted, the State Department, DHS, so on. The DHS bill itself actually evolved into Binding Operational Directive 2001, which became, basically Hack Federal Civilian, which BugCrowd's actually providing as a service, but we're pretty heavily involved in informing that for the 3 or 4 years up to the actual bill itself, or the mandate coming out on how it should be constructed, all those different things. And probably most recently, again in the US, was the work that we did out of Disclose.io, which transited again to BugCrowd as opportunity for the company to build safe harbor into vulnerability disclosure policy language for election security. That kicked off in 2018, and really, what became obvious there was the fact that there's cyber risk involved in election systems, but then there's this bigger issue of information risk, and this kind of idea of confidence and trust in the system itself. So it wasn't just about finding bugs; it was about being able to turn around to the voter who might not be technical and giving them some answers around like how this is being defended in a way that helps democracy not fall apart, right? So that became all of these things. I think the commonality was like looking for the win-win on both ends of things, right? Like the agenda from my perspective is how do you create a better environment for hackers to act as the internet's immune system. But then on their side, there's all of these different things that need to be done that, once you find those things to actually plug into, at that point, you can create some momentum, and ultimately it nets out to reform and change.
Yeah, great. Well, it very much mirrors the approach we took as the Internet Industry Association when we were active from the late 90s in fostering some of the laws that, became well known, the Spam Act in Australia and the Cybercrime Act being the main two, but also prime movers in the Privacy Act space as well.
Right.
And it was always around, when you're getting industry behind you, you really have to show what the upside is for them. And I guess the iCode experience that we're talking about with the discussions at the White House were around how do you convince US industry to emulate something that works in another jurisdiction. And I think with this, so moving to the current issue, which is really, what we are both super passionate about, is how can we develop consistent international or internationally consistent safe harbors that recognize the global nature of the enterprise that we're engaged in.
Yep.
But also, I guess, have to take into account some local considerations. So what I'd like, my vision for this sort of initiative, the zero-day legislative initiative, is really, firstly, we've got to get supporting partners on board, which we've started doing with you guys and Katie and Chris Painter and Kieran Martin and the Cyber Peace Institute, which are starting sort of advocates. Then we want to move to go talk to some funding partners about resourcing this so that we can actually start doing the multiple jurisdictional legal work. We want to do a gap analysis and do a global analysis. I don't think it's ever been done in a systematic way, at least. The OECD has pointed to this as being, you know, a bit of an impediment in security, and we sort of picked up on that paper and we're running with that idea. But in order to actually implement on the ground, we want to identify or create cells that have legislative, legal experience and technical capabilities or access to technical people. We bring them to visit the legislators, which both you and I have done in the past. And you sit them down, you explain, these are the laws now, this is the effect that it's having, these are the changes that we want. They may only be quite minor changes in terms of the language, but it's enough to then, and if we can start to build some momentum behind this. I mean, I know, Casey, that Katie Masouris was telling us about the sort of interim protections in the DMCA, but they're sort of quite ad hoc and they need to be renewed.
They are. They're updated. I think there's variations of this sort of activity that happen around the place, and that's one of them. So this is the DMCA carve out for good faith research. You know, the like election security got added on top of medical device security and connected vehicle security. I think it was 2018 or 2019. That was the last revision on that one. And there's, you know, things like that happen. They are kind of ad hoc. They're sort of, you know, I think reactive to whatever's on fire at that point in time, if that makes sense.
That's sort of the US approach, isn't it? Even if you look at their privacy stuff, it's very
it's very political. It's politically driven. So the more constituents are concerned about a particular problem, the more likely it is to actually get some attention, which is, you know, annoying but reasonable, I think.
Well, so this sort of makes part of that's part of the process, is we have to have that sort of cultural sensitivity that when you're running into a jurisdiction, you got to be sensitive to the way they do things, and it will vary. But I think so. That's sort of stage 2. Now, phase 1 was the launch and just getting out there publicly with this, which we've done. Phase 2 is going to go, and we'll be looking for your help in trying to get some introductions to organizations that might help with our resourcing of this.
For sure.
If you can have a bit of a think about which companies that you work with that believe this is a real issue and might be prepared to stump up some either in kind or you know, financial support.
No, definitely. So with that, just to put it on the table with Disclose.io, so effectively it's less focused on direct kind of legislative change as a lobby group, if that makes sense. It's more focused on standardization. You know, the thing that we've seen happen with BugCrowd is that and you know, right across the board, frankly, in security research, because of all of these like weirdnesses that exist in criminal law, and some of the translation of that criminal law into tort law, right? And then how that gets used, which ultimately creates a chilling effect for researchers. So CFAA is like the main example of that, but there's all sorts of others around the place. What you end up with this need for is almost like a patch on that law to be able to make it safe anyway. So that's kind of what Disclose.io is, right? Because it's basically saying, hey, you know, we need to, like, hacking illegally, like hacking for a malicious purpose, that should be illegal, and it should have like criminal or civil recourse associated with it. But you need to construct that in a way that doesn't inadvertently kind of catch up the people that are trying to help at the same time. So how can you, from a tort law standpoint, create a policy that you put out on a website that does all of that, and also is readable by someone who's not a lawyer and someone who potentially doesn't even speak English as a first language, right?
Right.
And also is sufficiently protective to both sides. So that's kind of really what we saw happening early on in Bugcrowd is everyone was copy pasting everyone else's stuff, because part of the challenge here is that lawyers don't, most of the time when they're asked to actually put this together, it's the first time they're doing it. And when lawyers get nervous, they get verbose. So you end up with like freaking War and Peace, right? No one really understands what's going on. There's loopholes all through it. There's all sorts of problems with it. So we wanted to condense that and try to simplify it. And that's a lot of what's happening in terms of the origin of the Disclose.io project. From that, what we've done at this point in time is created a vehicle for people to be able to basically just boilerplate their own policy. Like, here's the easy switch, right? So instead of, you can sort of see where I'm going, instead of going to the Senate Rules Committee and talking about CFAA reform or DOJ or whoever else, let's just make it easy for the user to implement their own thing. And the idea is if you can establish enough precedent around that, at that point, the precedent becomes the thing that drives change.
Perfect.
So that's
I see it as being hand in hand with what we're talking about here.
I think both are important, right? So I'm not saying
you're standardizing the policies. Once we've got sort of more standardized policy environment, then it's easier to see what the language needs to change in the law. And we might come up with some model language for the laws that we can, then promulgate internationally. So,
I think the other piece of it, for the sake of for your benefit and for the folks that are listening on the call after the fact as well, the idea of like, how do you turn this into basically a best practice that you can celebrate as an organization? So you're doing a VDP, that's fantastic. Most people aren't, like, gold star. But if you're then doing a VDP with a safe harbor clause, that's even better. If you've got proactive CBD timelines within that disclosure policy that then make you accountable for fixing the things that you're told, that's even better. And you create this kind of virtuous cycle that actually ends up attracting people to wanting to do this instead of it being a legislative kind of stick. So that's the other side of it, right? Because again, I think both are important, but that's
you need both. It's sort of like push pull, isn't it? At that point,
100%.
Yeah, but I mean, really, the legal changes we wanted there as a safety net when all else fails.
I think it's the overall framework. Like, we put a proposal into Senate Rules 2 or 3 years ago, and it was basically to invert the CFAA. So this idea of like unauthorized access, like accessing a computer without or beyond authorized permission, that in and of itself shouldn't be a crime unless it's coupled with another more traditionally understood crime. So that was kind of the proposal. Like, this on its own shouldn't be illegal, but if a computer's being used to commit fraud or theft or whatever else, then absolutely it should be. And at that point, it becomes an aggregating factor.
So it's an intent test, really, that you're putting in. I have a legal background as well. For better or worse, I know what you mean about being verbose when you don't know what you're talking about.
It's like they're doing their job. It's not a diss, but it is.
It's like just the covering is. But I think, when we had a hand in the Cybercrime Act in Australia, and that was in 2001. I think it was passed. So it was very early. It was really before the era of white hat hacking per se. I would say probably 20 years ago now, to the year. I think it is. And the intent provision there was that you intended to hack into or to unlawfully interfere with a computer or a computer system. So the intent element was that you weren't accidentally just, getting up in the middle of the night and sleepwalking to go and take out someone's server. But what we're talking about is another layer of intent beyond that, which is actually a malicious intent. And that's the threshold that we're going to use to separate out protected activities from those that should, as you say, be still subject to the full force of the law.
Absolutely.
And maybe even down the track, Casey, international sanctions, if we can get governments to actually take this seriously internally,
I mean, that's where this is going, and this is why it's partly why I'm on a bit of an end run to get adoption in a way that's positive sooner rather than later, because
Yeah.
I can feel kind of the clamps getting ready to come down on this whole thing. And if it's not in a state that drives a positive future for this conversation, then that's the point where I think it's actually at the most risk, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, cool. We're gonna regulate everything. Like you have to,
Yeah. Yeah.
Wassenaar, like we're pretty involved in that as well. I'm sure Katie
Mhm.
mentioned it. Um, Similar sort of thing. It's like the security industry screamed when those proposals came out a couple of years back, because it effectively regulated anything that could be interpreted as good faith research, and all of a sudden you're putting, it's like the bad guys are going to ignore this anyway. So like, why are we putting a,
That's
albatross
right,
on
actually. It's a
because
good
people
point. Is the good guys are the ones that will follow the law. They're the ones that are being
they're the ones who
hampered
get
by the
hurt.
law.
Yeah,
The bad guys don't care
I
about the
don't care.
law.
Like
And so whatever we do to the law isn't probably going to change their behavior. So who are we
this,
hurting? We're hurting
and
ourselves.
this is like, I don't know, it's a fine balancing act, because I think when you get the right audience and you can talk to them plainly, like people that are in, legislative authority, that have a military background, or people that come in from computer science, like they're not that common, but they do exist. If you can
Yeah.
speak to them, then at that point you can actually say, like, no one really gives a shit about what we write, that we actually care about as we write it. Like, it's not a
Right.
deterrent. Like, we need recourse and we need all of that stuff in place, but to think of this as a deterrent, all you're deterring at that point in time is the folk that are trying to help you, because they're not paying attention. And it gets a bit kind of, anarchist and sort of information entropy,
No, no.
but like folks that have been in an adversarial, scenario, or have that mindset, they tend to be able to glom onto that pretty quickly, I've found.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I've had a lot of history working with law enforcement and legislators.
Yeah.
And often it is really just a matter of sitting down with them and walking through it. So I think also, Casey, part of this process, maybe once we've done the legal analysis, is to then run some legislative forums in different jurisdictions.
I think that'd be
Go
awesome.
into the parliaments, go into the
Yeah.
Congress. We did it with spam with the FTC 2001. So you bring the legislators in, you bring the regulators in, you bring the practitioners in, and the legal drafters, and you have a conversation around where we are now, where we need to be, and the why of it.
Yeah, no,
And I think,
absolutely. I mean, there's hackers on the hill for that, in DC. So that's Bo Woods,
mhm,
like I Am the Cavalry, Harley Geiger, and those folk. They're all close friends. That's a model. Like, that particular model was one of the main sources of input into the Hack the XYZ bills out of Lou and Langvin's offices.
yeah,
It's pretty much just literally getting, hackers and people that can speak natively to this space in the same room
right,
as legislators, and like, yeah, we're all human. Like, let's have a conversation about what we're trying to solve here, because we're
yeah,
all actually trying to drive in the same direction. We're just experts at
mm,
different things. Um,
yeah,
that's been really effective. Same thing happened with election security. So, taking secretaries of state down to DEFCON, that kind of thing. Like, that does tend to have a pretty profound impact, I've seen.
very much. You
Yeah.
got to show them what it will look like.
Yeah.
It's the thing.
Yeah. And demystify the whole space. Like,
Exactly.
I think that's a big part of the challenge with this area, is that, and I think it's partly our fault too, because we kind of like being a bit, badass and wearing the hoodies and doing all those different things. The downside of that is that, people feel like it's unapproachable and just,
Mhm.
mystical and sort of dangerous. So if you can
Yeah.
remove that, then all of a sudden the conversation gets a lot easier.
Right. So what I'm hearing is we need to help demystify white hat hacking
Yeah,
into the broader population.
100%.
Let's start making some good hacker movies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. Like
You know anyone in Hollywood, Casey? I know Joseph Menn that wrote The Fatal System Era.
yeah, no,
You know Joe Menn?
Joe's
Yeah.
good. Yeah, I know Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of folk
Do a
like
movie.
I don't think there's a substitute for like literally just getting in the same space as the people that are going to make decisions. Like
Yeah,
the whole idea of like air cover, all these different things, with Disclose.io, the idea of creating, what we're working towards there is almost like the green padlock for vulnerability disclosure, right? So
hmm
you just come to recognize it as a thing that you should expect as a consumer, and then your
yeah,
behavior gravitates towards that, and that actually drives adoption in the process. So like there's all of these different air cover things that can be done, but when it comes to actually changing laws, I've not seen
mm,
anything be as effective as just getting into the same space and
yeah,
having a chat.
yeah. And I think that would be our preferred approach.
Yeah.
So listen, conscious of time, there's one other separate issue I want to talk to you
Yep.
about in a second around mental health and cybersecurity. It's something you've been liking on my LinkedIn lately, and I just wanted to give you a heads up of a program we want to launch next year, and you might be involved, might be
Certainly.
interested in supporting that, just even rhetorically on social media. But let's just finish off this point first. So, in terms of moving forward, let's keep the information flow going. From your end, if you can just start thinking about some organizations that we can tap to go and have a word with about resourcing and where the sort of benefit will be for them if they don't already know what
Yep.
safer laws will do to benefit. Now, without naming names, are there, there are the good companies that are already supportive of bug bounties and disclosure, and then there are those that are at the other end that are suing people. But
Yep.
amongst the
And
good
then
ones
the very large chunk in the middle as well, I
in the
think.
middle, but amongst the really, let's say the early adopters, the sort of icons that do they understand that the legal issues are chill already on research? Do we have to make that argument, or are they already there with that?
I think they're already there with that for the better part, and it would be pretty easy to generate a list of folk that are in that camp. They're
Yeah,
probably already making a bunch of noise about this stuff to begin with,
right.
like in terms of
Yeah.
hacker advocacy, not necessarily like direct lobbying for legal
Mm,
reform, but just advocating for hacker rights and different things like that.
right.
So
Well, so that's our little narrow mission here, is from science point of view, at least with our partner organizations, is let's just go in on that one question of legal rights,
yeah,
and that then you can articulate that as how that fits within the broad spectrum of the other work that you're doing around policy.
yeah, no, 100%. Yep.
Yeah, great. Well, that's good. So I'll wait for you to come back to me
On
with
that.
some contacts there, some intros maybe, and then we
Yep.
can keep it running here. I think it looks like we're starting Europe, the US, and Australia, all three in tandem.
Yeah, nice.
But that wouldn't rule out other. I mean, I think if we can get some momentum in those three jurisdictions, because that's where we are.
Yeah, I
And
think the thing to think about there is just do you deliberately want to break out of the like AUKUS like West thing from the get go?
I don't think from the get go, and
Yeah,
only not because notionally.
I'm not advocating in either direction, by the way.
No,
So
no, no, no. I'm just saying, I think from a practical standpoint, it just makes sense right now. I mean, AUKUS plus Europe. So
yeah,
it'll be AUKUS EU.
yeah.
Yeah, AUKUS.
AUKUS, like Ode
AUKUS.
AUKUS, something like that. Yeah, I got it.
So I'd say that sort of central core of places where I guess we've got the most
Yeah,
established
go with this
presence.
favor. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then what we'll do is we'll use a aggregation strategy where we'll bring in other nations. I mean, I've had some relations with the Indian government. I'm sure that you've got many governments you've spoken to as well.
Yeah.
So I think we'll invite. I mean, it has to be an open invitation, but I think if we can show some activity, some legislative forums, maybe as a first step, to show them what it looks like, and then we can replicate that argument to make. But
Yeah, definitely.
cool. All right. Well,
Well, that's
look,
cool.
I
Keen to,
should let you
keen, keen
go
to
because
understand that better as we go along. Yeah, I've got to bounce to another thing, but great to meet. And
yeah,
we'll
you too.
stay in touch.